All right, Chag Lowry, thank you so much for joining us today at Tribe Called Geek. It's thrilling to finally get the chance to chat with you. I know our founder, Lee, and a lot of our readers are definitely big fans of your work. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. It really means a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Before we dive into some of the questions, would you mind just sharing with our fan base a little bit about just yourself, where you come from? Just what does a person need to know about Chag Lowry?
Yeah, well, thank you. So, I was raised on my father's ancestral lands in northeastern California. I'm Mountain Maidu and Pit River. Those are two cultures from that area. And then on my mother's side, I am of Yurok ancestry and lived there and went to Humboldt State University. And the Yurok tribe is the largest indigenous tribe in California. And our ancestral lands are along the Klamath River, the lower part of the Klamath River, and where it empties into the Pacific. And it's redwood country. So, and then my family and I currently live in San Diego. I work at UC San Diego in health, the School of Public Health, but comics and writing are my passion work. And I was fortunate just to be raised around a lot of storytellers and always loved comics. Like I'm old enough to say, yeah, back in the day, I bought comics off the rack. So, and the comics I remember are GI Joe, Detective Comics. Uh, let's see, the Wolverine. His series had just started to come out. I remember this was like in high school, eighth grade maybe. Uh, but I had an uncle that also collected the. He had comics from DC, like Man Thing
Oh,
and
nice.
kind of the horror
Yeah.
uh, and supernatural comics. And I remember looking at those even at a younger age. And then I also have always liked the DC war comics, Joe
Hmm.
Kubert, Russ Heath, all of those, the Unknown Soldier and Sergeant Rock, because my late grandfather was an actual sergeant in World War II in the American Army. And so I wrote a book on his generation where I interviewed a lot of uh, servicemen, and then there were a lot of Native women from that generation that were riveters. They and worked in aircraft factories, and so those interviews uh, really helped guide a lot of my storytelling in my comics.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because that really ties in well to what I wanted to ask you about too. Like so much of your work has to do with Native veterans. Especially, this I think one of your best known works in Soldiers Unknown really deals with a number of Northern California Indigenous veterans during World War II, or I'm sorry, World War One. And I really loved those stories. I think World War One is definitely an era of history that gets looked over a lot, unfortunately. And we hear a lot about, even in the Indian country, we hear a lot about, World War II veterans from Indian country. There's so many, like, that was the big era of code talkers and all of them. Um, and but what so sounds like, given that you have such a connection in your own family, was that what drew you to wanting to tell these veteran stories, or what connected with those that you wanted to really spend time telling these stories?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So when I interviewed a lot of the World War II and Korean War veterans that I knew, a lot of them would be, and they would, and I interviewed almost 70
Wow.
vets over the course of a couple of years, just word of mouth, and on my own time, I would travel around Northern California, and a lot of them would bring out family photos, or they would start to talk, and many of them would say, "Well, my dad," or "Oh, I had an older brother that was in World War I."
Wow.
And they would sometimes they would have actual service photos of them and would share them with me, and I was always amazed by that. And so after those experiences and seeing those images, I did a lot of research and just a lot of reading, as much about World War I as possible. And they're so connected, right? World War I and
Yeah.
World War II. There's only 20 years apart. Uh, but World War I is amazing, that time period, because here in California, uh, so World War I happened, the Americans came in 1917, 1918. We were still at the tail end of the physical genocide in
Mm,
California that was
right.
happening, especially up north. Uh, and so it always amazed me that, you had survivors of the massacres that happened in Northern California. And then here you also had these men from tribes who were, went into the service, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes they were, they were drafted and then sent to France, to fight for democracy, right? Like,
Right.
it just boggled my mind.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the fact that there isn't a whole lot of imagery about Native people in that time period,
Right.
right? Really out there. It's like, the 1900 to 1950 is almost like this big blank
Hmm.
canvas, if you throw out all the stereotypical, stuff
Right.
that's out there. So I wanted to delve into that story and honor those real life experiences that I was told, and then really wanted to have it be in color.
Mm,
Working with Rasan Ekadal, uh, was amazing. It took 3.5 years
wow.
uh, for the graphic novel for us to work together, uh, and but yeah, like there's a scene in the story where the family is just sitting at a dinner table
Hmm.
right after the boys are told that you're going to have to go into the service, you're going to have to probably go fight. So they're sitting at a dinner table, and I always love that, because I always thought, well, I never saw a Native family sitting at a dinner table in any movie or any comic or any, and
Yeah.
so just that single scene was, I'm happy for it, because like, yeah, we sit at dinner tables like anyone else. And uh so uh yeah, that's kind of the genesis of where that story came from. A lot of this, the war scenes, they're based on actual memories that people, uh men who were in World War II talked about. But it's uh the emotions are the same.
Right.
uh and I really wanted the men, Rasan did a fantastic job, I thought, of conveying the emotions on the faces of the
Yeah.
characters. And you never see that on Native men, right, in stories. At least it's different now in the last couple of years, right? Because we have
Yeah.
reservation dogs. We have, there's been huge a renaissance, I would say, in the last couple of years. But Soldiers Unknown came out, uh, before that, before streaming, and so yeah, I really wanted the emotional scenes to be centered on the Native men.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really a powerful work. It might have been the first comic I read that was a historical comic. I'm more drawn to, I don't know, generally fiction, more fiction titles. But like going through it, I'm like, this is honestly one of the best comics I've read. Like, it was just powerfully moving, and um, just really captures just the humanity of what these men went through. And I think also did a really great job of capturing kind of a native specific experience in that time, like, tying it into for I mean, kind of all native people west of the Mississippi. It was a time like very shortly after, the end of the active military conquest, and it's, especially in California, the end of the active extermination efforts. So yeah, like such a compelling story to how there was such a quick time between those two eras, you know. Um, but I kind of getting into that, I like what you said about there's being so much more kind of native representation. When we're gonna get to that. But these stories are so compelling. And you said you wanted to be in color, but like with this one and even your other works, what drew you to comics to want to tell these stories? I mean, clearly you're a fan, of course, of comics as a medium. But why did you think that was the right medium for you to work in for telling these stories?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I look at just pop culture in general,
Mm,
and again, uh, I went to high school in the early '90s,
mm,
and then went to college. So I'm from a time period, I think, where we had just had a lot of stereotypical, generic and racist pop culture imagery and storytelling about Native people. And
right.
I always thought, well, yeah, I love comics, and I worked in PBS. I directed short documentaries and did interviews for PBS station up in Northern California. And the storyboarding process is a part of
Yeah.
that. And so comics are like built in; they're the natural storyboard, right, for stories. Uh, so there was that element, but then I also just thought, well, uh, as an education tool and as an ability as a native storyteller to own the foundation of a story, I would do it in comic format because my hope would be like, oh, maybe one day, you know, uh, someone out there would want to make a film or a series based on my comic stories.
Mhm.
But I wanted to be able to have the comic in place so that I have my say. It's there and nobody can alter it or change it unless I give permission. And I think as native authors and storytellers, we have not just the right to retain that ownership, but we have a responsibility if we're going to be telling stories about history or culture. I think we also have the right to tell fantastic made up stories too,
Oh yeah,
if we want.
absolutely.
But a lot of my work right now has been focused on more of the historical and cultural aspects of my people.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, I think that you get to be such a voice for California, you know, native native nations, and you coming from several, I think just really gives that so much more credence. Because I think in the wider narrative, like you kind of have like the big nations who get a lot of attention. But like, it's like we need to hear from California. Like it's the most ethnically diverse place historically for Native nations, and some of the most incredible stories are uh, coming from there. So like you saying that, and quick aside, you mentioned your Yurok. I'm Ojibwe. And so like you guys speak an Algic language like us. So I was like, oh cool, we kind of have that like I remember learning about that at one time. You're like, that's kind of crazy because like all the Algic folks are kind of like more along the Canadian border, and then there's like Yurok and like the one other one just in California. Like, where'd you guys come from? Like,
No, huh? That's it's fascinating. The language connectivity is beautiful. And my wife Rebecca is of Lenape ancestry, so
oh,
another.
there you go.
So we're always like, oh, from the east and the west. And I love that you bring that up because I love storytelling connects us, right? And because
Absolutely.
of the disruption that we as Native people have had for, decades and hundreds of years, storytelling is so healing because then, right now, every time I ever think of you, I'm always going to feel connected to you in that way, right? Language wise, and then comic wise, and storytelling. And that's the beauty, I think, as Native storytellers and artists. Like, it's all healing as well. We have a lot of healing that we need to go through, and the artists are the ones that lead that way, I think. And comic books are fun too, right? Everybody like, I like going to comic cons and talk about comics, and it's fun.
Yeah, it's always a good time, and I feel like in so many ways comics are kind of a natural flow from just historically how we've always told stories through pictures. Like, I mean, I've not come across a Native nation that didn't use pictures to tell stories. It's probably one of the most human things that there are. Um, and so it's just a very natural medium. And so given that, like, you're coming at this from the writing side, your work has such beautiful art. And you've worked with both native and non-native artists. So when you're working with these artists, do you try to give a lot of input for their creation, or do you really want them to be like, here's the story, here's my script, give it your spin on it. I really want you to make this your own as well. What's your approach to that collaboration?
I appreciate that question. So I think it depends on the artist,
Mm.
but I've been very fortunate to work with artists who have the amazing abilities. Like, wow, how did they get that so right? Like, I wrote a description in the or some dialogue, and then they just nail it. If it was like a cultural image, or like a more of a history based, where, like in Soldiers Unknown, we had to get the uniforms right and the type of weaponry right, because there's a lot of people out there that love to,
That's
especially
true. That's yeah,
war enthusiasts. If the button is on the wrong side of the collar, they will call you out on it, right? So that kind of detail, yeah, I had to be strict with it and say, this is how it goes. But for other parts of the story, yeah, I'm a big believer in, you don't limit the artist. I mean, they're bringing a lot of ability and talent to it, to the creative process, and let it go, let it flow. If they feel something or want to convey something, but how we do it is, I'll send my script and we'll do thumbnail sketches first.
mm,
So they'll thumbnail it, like really brief, basic uh, pencil work, and that's where I will say, okay, maybe their scene could, look this way. Uh, but after that, then it goes, the inking and the coloring, and I don't change it, because I want to honor the artist and go from there.
cool. Yeah. Well, I want to transition a little bit into uh, another one of your works that I have here, my sisters, and perhaps this could also help to talk about some of your work that's coming up. You got to work with Weshoyot Alvitre, um, who's amazing and just really blowing up in comics, period, but certainly in native comics, she's a household name. Um, this work, though, uh, takes the perspective of baskets, traditional baskets that are made, like, and the perspective the baskets have of inviting women to harvest the materials and then to create them, and then their perspective once they exist as baskets, what they give to people. And um, this is such a integral part of I think a lot of native cultures is what's come to be known as in English other than human persons. Um, so when telling stories of um, other than human persons, like how do you try to capture that voice And is there other ways that, and again, I know you might have some other works coming up soon that might really tie into this. Are there other voices you want to bring from more other than human persons?
Yeah, I really like how you summarized that. That was pretty awesome.
Thanks.
Um,
I also work at a university, so.
yeah. Well, but I mean, you summarized it in a cultural way, and to me, like you understand. I appreciate that you have that connectivity and can understand that. Yeah, as Native people, I think we were all taught that we can tap into um, other ways of being and more enlightened feeling. And what represents that often, when I was growing up, were baskets.
Mm.
That's the manifestation, the physical manifestation of connectivity and being and mindfulness and spiritualness. And yeah, as humans, I think that there are other avenues for us to learn. And baskets, see, on my mom's side in Yurok culture, uh, when certain baskets are used in ceremony, after that they are considered living members of society.
Wow.
And so, and they're meant to be used in ceremony. They're meant to be danced in the ceremony, not meant to be in a museum, right? And so I was always fascinated by that baskets have a voice, the baskets have a spirit. And I always thought, well, if I wrote a story, if uh and basketry for the most part is the women's activity. So I didn't want to try and write, from the women's side because that's not respectful. But I thought I could write from the basket side. I could, and so that's what compelled me to write that story. And then it was amazing to collaborate with Weshoyot because she is of Tongva ancestry, so from down south, and then I'm from up north. And again, going back to that ability for stories to connect between cultures, like it's an all California native collaboration.
Yeah.
And she also wrote, parts in that story too that pertain to the Tongva basketry experience and journey. And so I wrote it, a couple of the pages from the Yurok side,
Mm.
which was my mom's, and then she wrote hers, and then I finished with my dad's side, the Maidu. So that's something also that I feel is important. And I'm not a fan of pan Indianism. We are all from specific places and specific cultures, and so storytelling at this point, again, because we're in the Renaissance, right,
Mhm.
where you're getting not just native, but you're getting specific cultural perspectives. And that even within native nations, there are differences, right? There are village differences, dialect differences, generational differences. They all should be respected and given equal platforms, in my mind. So, and then going back to, storytellers other than human, Weshoyot and I are creating a story on fire, and fire will be the narrator in that story because fire is central. And I think we're kind of undergoing a renaissance in the cultural burning, the
Mhm.
reintroduction of good fire is what they call it
Mhm.
in our on our homelands. When we talk about land back, we also need to have fire back because fire is the cleanser. And for our basket materials, they have to, the roots of certain materials have to be renewed through fire every year for our traditional foods. And then just for clean forests, for gathering spots. So I've always thought like, oh wow, fire has a story. And our land relationships, that's another way I think that we use sequential imagery as Native people, is in the very land relationship, and how those artists used fire, right? They didn't just set a fire just anywhere. They there was a methodology and a discipline to it, just like with basketry. And sometimes uh, it's easier if you have uh, a character other than humans conveying certain knowledge. Like if Yoda, the Jedi Master, says something, it's different, right? Because he's Yoda, as opposed to Luke, who is human. And so yeah, I like that concept. And we have our own versions of Yoda, right? And that could be the redwood trees, it could be the river, could be fire. Uh,
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. It's so true. And I really that's going to give me stuff to chew on, actually. I'm just like I'm going to come back to what you said just in my own reflections for a while, I think. Um one thing that actually surprised me in one of your story in Soldiers Unknown actually was what I think you referred to in the story as the men's game of the stick in the little bolo game.
yeah,
We have that game too, but for us it's a women's game. And most nations in my area, in kind of the more central Midwest part of the country, consider that. So like seeing that, I'm like, that's so interesting that you have the same game, or a very similar one at least, and that it's kind of taken on this different role. Um, like this is how we learn from each other, even like that we have different understandings of very similar things. Even like I think that's so important and valuable. Um, well, given that, I want to circle a little bit to, uh, we touched a bit on native visibility in pop culture, that it's really at an all-time high right now, which is thrilling, but we're still a pretty small slice of the pie when you really zoom out and take a look. Um, biggest slice we've had, but not a big piece still. Your work in comics is pretty known. But when you look at the comics industry, and look at Native folks in comics, either represented as characters or folks who are working in comics, do you just make sure I'm reading my question correctly. How do you see that representation playing out now? And what do you think still needs to be done going forward as we hopefully increase more visibility and can tell these stories better?
I will take this opportunity to really thank Lee Francis for everything that he's done. uh, I met Weshoyot at Indigenous Comic Con in Albuquerque. Uh, so the ability for us to connect as native creative, artists is still, I think, the most key need. And so, I hope to go to Indigipop uh, in a couple of weeks, and meet people and connect and see if we if there's a way to collaborate. Uh, for the overall industry, like I'm pretty I love a lot of the stories. I've know Image and IDW and all those
Hmm.
independent companies, uh, but I'm always cautious about non-native companies owning the rights to native characters and native stories. So uh, I prefer to see us owning our own
Hmm.
publishing imprints, owning the process of having native editors. Um, and that's the side that I'm most interested in trying to be impactful in right now. Like,
Hmm.
uh, so, um, And there's just the trust thing. Like I would not really trust these large corporations, with our imagery and our stories. Having said that, like I love the Echo series.
It's
I
great.
thought,
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Echo was, and then that episode where they had the lacrosse, and it
Mhm.
was men and women, and that was fascinating to me to see, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, so there is a way to do it, I think, to shepherd those stories through, because Echo was created by, Marvel, is owned by Marvel, the character. Uh, but I really think, going back, I think to Lee, what I view as Lee's vision, is that we own it ourselves, we tell it ourselves, well, we are responsible to ourselves in a good way. So, yeah, I encourage people to support his Indigipop and, his efforts to get us linked,
Hmm.
collaborate more. And then maybe one day, we'll be on par with Marvel, or, if that's a goal, right?
If that's a goal, right. Right.
But like you say, yeah, there's still so much that every place in this country has a native story behind it.
Right.
Every rock, every type of water, every type of tree, right? There's power in all of our ancestral lands. And whether we live on them or not, as native people, we carry that.
Yeah.
And I think it's awesome to, as you mentioned earlier, yeah, as native people, we've always used sequential art to tell our stories, whether it's in basketry, our architecture, the storytelling itself, sitting by the campfire,
Mhm.
and then the land relationship, how we, uh, used fire, used water to tell the story of who we are on our lands, right? They weren't just wild, unused lands, right?
Right.
So, uh, yeah, I think there's just so much, and I'm hopeful, when we have like Sturlin Harjo, who, did Reservation Dogs, but I am so thankful that, he clearly believes in good mentorship,
Mhm.
right? He clearly uplifted other Native writers and actors. And I think that's a key too. We'll only grow as Native nations and Native storytellers if we continue to mentor each other and help each other. So I'm, thankful that, I mean, that's what you're doing, right? It's good work. It's
Right.
needed. It's necessary, right? And I think it takes us back to those times before contact when I think we did that a lot more as Native people. We didn't compete against each other unless we were in stick games or lacrosse, or there were,
Yeah, right,
you
right.
know. But I would like to think that we were more helpful to each other than anything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like to think that too, and just even thinking of all the ways that we had for avoiding violent conflict, and our games were such a big part of that. But even stories and finding ways to come together. I have a friend who's a hoop dancer, and he talked about how you might go from your village to another village where they speak a different language, but you could bring out the hoop, and through the dancing of that, that could be a way you could connect and find ways to share and find common ground, even if you couldn't communicate verbally very clearly. Um, and I need to correct something I said earlier. I said Lee was our founder. Actually, it's Johnny J, who's our founder, but Lee is our current director and has been a huge part in directing all this, Lee Francis. So both of them are just, huge in comics and pop culture. Um, well, I want to definitely get into some of what you have coming up. Folks got to know, like, we got fans of you who are eagerly anticipating more from Chag Lowry. So, what's next? What can we look forward to from you?
Well, thank you. So I'll share a quick image here.
Yes, please.
And this is a story that I crafted with Weshoyot Alvitre, called Where the Water Flows Strong. And it's a comic that has been out for a while. It was funded by Save California Salmon. They're a
Mm.
nonprofit having to do with water advocacy and water rights, specific to the Klamath River in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Right now, the Klamath is undergoing the largest dam removal in US history and possibly global history. It had 5 dams on it, and they're taking 4 of them out. They just took one out, and maybe the second one is almost completely taken out. So my comic was to honor the advocacy that had to take place for decades to get to the place of, taking those dams out and restoring the salmon runs and restoring the health of the river system that multiple tribal nations, including the Yurok, the Hupa, the Karuk, the Sinangwe, and then up into the Klamath area up in Southern Oregon, all those cultures were all connected to that river. So this is the cover. And I love working with Weshoyot because we've done a couple comics now, and this is the front and back cover combined, the connected
Oh,
cover.
huh.
One day I hope to do I growing up, I would buy the gimmick cover comics, the
Oh,
glossy and the
oh yeah.
shiny stuff.
Yeah, like
And
those limited runs from like Todd McFarlane and yeah, all those ones.
yeah, like the sketch covers, the
Oh,
one
okay.
50. So with Washoya, because she can do anything as an artist,
Yeah.
like she can do it. Like she's the artist that I'm going to work with and like do my own version of different types of covers. And so that cover was the first full wrap cover. And if people are interested, they would just Google search Save California Salmon, and they buy the comic from them. And then here's the cover to the latest story. This is my sci-fi story called Reflections that I co-created with my good buddy Corey Gray, who is Blackfoot, and he is a scientist, and we went to college together, and then we worked with the artist Eli Hyder, who does amazing sci-fi art and Star Wars art.
Mm.
Uh, you can look him up on Instagram. It's called at Venomous, at VENIMOUS, Venomous, which is a Star Wars name. But so this story kind of honors Corey and his work in science and gravitational waves. And I told him, oh, let's write a story based on your experience, with because Einstein in real life had a theory on gravitational waves that Corey's science team verified several years ago in real life. And when they verified it, they sent an announcement into the science world saying this is, what we discovered, and we peer reviewed it, and we verified Einstein's theory. And so Corey's mom speaks their language, and
Mm.
so she translated the scientific announcement in their language. So along with the French and the Russian and the Spanish version of the announcement, their indigenous language was used, and it was the only one.
Wow.
And so from that real life experience, I said, let's talk about this pretend story where there's a theory that Einstein had, that he worked with elders from Corey's, culture, but that theory leads to a wormhole that can be traveled, and when you travel to it, you travel to the indigenous uncolonized solar system. You know how like in Black Panther, the
Yeah.
country of Wakanda, right, is the uncolonized African country. Well, I thought at first I was going to say, let's create our own world, our own uncolonized indigenous world.
Right.
Now I'm thinking, no, let's just have our own solar system.
There you go.
And,
Why
you know,
stop at a world?
yeah, no. So this theory, that's what's written out on there, and that's character based on Corey's mom. So this first chapter is all about introducing the scientist, and then there are native protectors in the story, and they're native women who have these suits of and their suits, and I'll show you here in just a second. They're suits of sentient obsidian.
Oh, wow.
So
That's a very native idea.
here's
Whoa.
when she's powered up.
Okay.
So, and yeah, like you say, obsidian is very significant
Yeah.
in I would say all of our cultures.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
on one of these other worlds, the obsidian is sentient, and each of these indigenous women, they partner with a certain color of obsidian, right? Because obsidian is all colors,
Right.
and each culture has a color, and the suit has different abilities. But I really like, the idea of, these are our native women who are the ones who go out and kick ass and protect us. And so this first chapter, that reflections, is the first chapter, and that's out. And uh, people want to go to Lee his website, or he's going to have them at Indigipop copies. So, and then yeah, I'll have further chapters of that. And then I'm really big on, I want to do some a native horror anthology. So I've got some good stories in mind for that. And but again, this is like my passion work, and sometimes I can create the stories and find funding to create them quicker, and sometimes they take a while. So if you know any millionaires or billionaires, send them my way. Like,
Yeah.
uh,
I'm still working on breaking into those circles. Like,
okay, well,
yeah.
I have to ask, right?
Yeah, no, fair,
Tell
fair
you
to ask.
that.
Yeah, I know there's so many projects I just want to fund. Um, great. So then that's through a tribe called Geek Publishing, I think is the name of the.
No, this is my own publishing. So
Oh, okay.
I created an imprint called Original Voices.
Original Voices.
And,
Oh, that's yours. Okay.
yeah, that's me. The Soldiers Unknown was printed by Great Oak Press, published, which is a tribally owned press. The Pechanga tribe in Southern California is very fortunate to partner with them. But all the other stories I produce on my own, going back to that, responsibility piece of, I'm responsible for this imagery and these stories, and if they're based on my people or Corey's people, then our names should be there as a way of saying this is who's responsible. And if anybody wants to critique it, they can. And so, but yeah, I'm excited, for the possibilities. Going to Indigipop will be different for me this time because I'll have more comics, as opposed to when I went to Albuquerque, I just had ideas. Right? Very cool.
Yeah, yeah, some finished products. Well, that's really exciting. And well, last thing I'll ask then, if folks want to follow along with you, see what you're working on, where can they do that? What's the best way to keep up with
Yeah,
you?
I'm on that ancient platform called Facebook.
Here you go.
uh, but um, No MySpace. I was never on
That's,
MySpace.
that's
I-
fair.
right. But I'm also on Instagram. It's just at Chag_Lowry. And yeah, I mostly will post just about my comic stuff on both of those. So
Great.
yeah.
Great. Well, yeah, give Chag a follow, folks. Chag, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm glad we could coordinate. It's really meant a lot and was really, really eye-opening for me too.
But yeah, thank you again. I very much appreciate, yeah, we got to have storytellers, but we got to have those good cultural connectors like yourself too. So thank you for all the good that you are, the goodwill and the good medicine that you're carrying, connecting us.
I do what I can. I do what I can to play a small role. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in.